I'm going to tell you something that most people can't process the first time they hear it, so I'll say it plainly and give you a moment to sit with it before we go further. The man who framed me for armed robbery and aggravated assault, the man whose silence put me in a Pennsylvania state prison at 22 years old and kept me there for 11 years, was standing in my mother's living room the night I came home. He was holding a plastic cup of fruit punch. He was wearing a collared shirt. He hugged me at the door and said into my ear with his arms around my back, "Welcome home, brother." His name is Gerald, and for 11 years while I was inside, he was my mother's most reliable source of support. He mowed her lawn. He drove her to church. He fixed her gutters one fall when she couldn't afford to hire anyone. He sat at her table and ate her cooking and let her believe he was a good man, the best friend her innocent son had ever had. He did all of this knowing exactly what he had done to me. I need to start earlier, though, because the night of my arrest is where everything began, and if you don't understand that night, you won't understand anything else. I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I was the second of three kids, older sister Denise, younger brother Calvin, and my mother raised us mostly alone after my father left when I was 9. We weren't poor in the dramatic sense, but we were close enough to it that money was always a presence in the house, always something being managed and stretched and worried over. I was a decent student, not exceptional. I played basketball badly but enthusiastically. I had a group of friends I'd known since middle school, and Gerald was one of them. Had been since we were 13 years old when he moved into the apartment 2 floors above ours, and we discovered we both thought the same TV shows were funny. By 22, I was working at a loading dock and taking 2 community college classes at night and trying to figure out what my life was supposed to look like. Gerald was working less and spending more, which I noticed but didn't examine closely enough. He had a girlfriend, he had a car that seemed nicer than what he could afford. I assumed he was doing odd jobs, hustle work, the kind of thing young men in our neighborhood did to bridge the gap between what they earned and what they needed. I didn't know he was robbing people. The night of October 14th, 2009 is a night I have reconstructed so many times in prison therapy sessions and legal meetings and eventually in testimony that it has the quality of a film I've seen too often, clear in every detail, worn smooth from handling. I was at Gerald's apartment that evening. We watched the game, I left around 9:30, walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, went home. That is the entirety of my alibi. I watched television with the man who was about to destroy my life, and then I went home. What Gerald did after I left, according to the account that eventually emerged 11 years later, was pull on a dark hoodie and rob a convenience store 4 blocks away. He hit the clerk with the butt of a pistol when the man reached for something under the counter. The clerk suffered a fractured orbital bone and a concussion. Gerald took the cash from the register, $340, and ran. A witness outside described a tall black man in a dark hoodie running from the scene. That description, in our neighborhood in 2009, was not so narrow as to be useful. But the police had something more specific within 48 hours, a tip. An anonymous tip to the tip line naming me by name and giving my address. The tip came from Gerald's phone. We know this now. We did not know it then. The investigation moved quickly after that. I was picked up for questioning and made the mistake, the catastrophic, life-altering mistake of agreeing to talk to detectives without a lawyer present. I was 22. I had nothing to hide. I thought that people who had nothing to hide didn't need lawyers because nobody had ever sat me down and explained that the interrogation room is not designed to find the truth. It's designed to build a case. I told them where I was that night. I told them I'd been at Gerald's. The detective asked if Gerald could confirm that. I said, yes. Gerald, when they called him, said he hadn't seen me that night. I have spent a long time trying to understand what Gerald was thinking in that moment. Whether he expected me to beat the case anyway, whether he told himself it would work out, whether he believed in some calculus I can't access that this was survivable for me, that I'd be questioned and released and the whole thing would blow over and he'd never have to admit what he had done. I don't know. I've never been able to ask him directly. I've tried to in my mind, in the 11 years I had with nothing but time and my own thoughts, and I never land anywhere satisfying. I was charged. The case against me was thin, but not impossible. The anonymous tip, a grainy ATM camera image from a block away that showed someone roughly my build in a dark hoodie, Gerald's statement that I hadn't been with him that night, and the prior arrest, minor, a disorderly conduct charge from a parking lot fight when I was 19, that the prosecution used to sketch a picture of someone with a capacity for violence. My public defender was overworked in the way public defenders are always overworked. We met 4 times before trial. She was not incompetent, but she was not equipped to dismantle what needed dismantling. And I was too young and too scared and too certain that the truth would surface on its own to push hard enough. It didn't. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced me to 12 to 20 years. I was 22 years old, standing in a courtroom in a suit my mother had bought at a consignment shop, listening to a number that rearranged my entire future in a single breath. My mother cried. The Neath put her arm around her. Calvin, who was 17, sat very still with his hands in his lap in a way I can still see when I close my eyes. I went in. I'm not going to tell you that prison made me stronger in some redemptive, after-school special way, because the truth is more complicated than that. Prison is violent and grinding, and it does things to your sense of time and self that don't fully reverse. I spent years angry. At Gerald, at the detectives, at the jury, at the system, at myself for talking without a lawyer, at the specific cruelty of a universe that had allowed this to happen. The anger was useful sometimes. It kept me alert. It kept me from disappearing into the particular despair that takes some men inside and doesn't give them back. But I also spent years doing other things. I got my GED in the first year. I read constantly, history, law, anything about wrongful conviction because reading about it felt like touching the shape of what had happened to me. I filed every program available. I filed my own appeals with help from a jailhouse lawyer named Patterson, who was smarter than most actual lawyers I'd later meet, though his case was a tragedy for different reasons. The appeals went nowhere for years. The break came in year 8. From a direction I hadn't expected. Gerald robbed someone again. He'd apparently stayed clean for several years after I went in, or at least uncaught, but in 2017 he was arrested for a robbery in Philadelphia, where he'd moved. During the investigation, a detective ran his record and found a 2009 anonymous tip that had originated from his phone number, a connection that hadn't been made at the time because the tip line record from that era had been poorly maintained and the number hadn't been traced. A DA investigator in Philadelphia made a call to Harrisburg. Harrisburg pulled my file. An Innocence Project lawyer named Carla Reeves called me on a Tuesday morning in the spring. She said she'd been reviewing my case at the request of the DA's office. She says she thought there was something there. She said the word exoneration in a careful, qualified way. Not a promise, just a direction. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we hung up. I was exonerated in March of 2020, 3 weeks before the pandemic shut the world down. The timing was surreal. My release happened into a world that was simultaneously falling apart, which meant there was no crowd outside, no news cameras, none of the images you see in exoneration stories. There was my mother, in a mask, in the parking lot of the correctional facility, and she held me for a long time without saying anything, and that was exactly right. Gerald was charged with filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, and perjury. He pleaded to a reduced charge and received 18 months. He served 11. I am not going to say what I think about that math, because I think if I start, I won't stop. Now, the welcome home party. Here is something that people who haven't lived through what I've lived through don't always understand. The timeline of information in these situations is not clean. The exoneration process was ongoing. Gerald's charges were filed after I was released. My mother knew I'd been exonerated, but the full picture of Gerald's role, the phone tip, the false statement, the deliberate nature of what he'd done, was still emerging in the weeks after my release. My mother knew Gerald had been involved in the case. She did not yet know the depth of it. Gerald apparently had not told her. Gerald apparently had spent 11 years cultivating her trust, keeping close, being useful, being present, being, I can only assume, the thing that made him feel less monstrous to himself. If my mother believed in him, maybe he could believe in himself. That is the only psychological logic I've been able to construct for it. So when I walked through my mother's front door on that first evening, still raw from everything, still adjusting to the texture of a world I'd been removed from for 11 years, Gerald was there. And I didn't know yet. Not the phone records, not the specifics. I knew he denied my alibi, but I hadn't yet received the full documentation of what he'd done. I was still in the haze of freedom, which is its own disorienting state. He hugged me. He said, "Welcome home." I didn't hug him back properly. Something in my body knew, even if my mind was still catching up. 3 weeks later, Carla walked me through the phone records. My mother's reaction when I told her, when I sat with her at her kitchen table and laid out the documented timeline, was one of the hardest things I have ever watched. She had trusted this man. She had accepted his lawn mowing and his church rides and his gutter fixing as evidence of character, when what they actually were was evidence of guilt. She hadn't known she was being managed. She had just thought she had a good person in her corner. She hasn't spoken to Gerald since. Neither have I. Not directly. His sentencing happened without my presence. I chose not to attend for the same reason I chosen to attend Rachel. I'm drawing a parallel to a story you haven't read yet, sorry. For the reason that watching someone perform remorse in a courtroom is not the same as receiving it, and I wasn't interested in the performance. I'm 33 years old now. I have an apartment in Harrisburg, a job with a nonprofit that works on criminal justice reform, and a relationship with a woman named Sasha who has more patience than I probably deserve, and who has never once made me feel like my history is something I need to apologize for. I have a therapist I've been seeing for 3 years who has helped me understand that what happened to me was not a reflection of my worth or my luck or some cosmic ledger, but simply a terrible thing done by a frightened person who made choices he couldn't take back. Pennsylvania has since paid me compensation through the wrongful conviction fund. I won't say the amount, but I'll say it doesn't come close to 11 years. Nothing would. My brother Calvin is 30 years old now. He was 17 when I went in. I missed his entire adult life, his college years, his first job, his wedding, the birth of his daughter, my niece, Imani, who was 3 years old when I was exonerated and is now 5 and calls me Uncle Marcus, which is not my name, but which I find I don't want to correct. I missed all of that. Gerald did not miss any of it. He was at my brother's wedding. I have the photos. He is smiling in them. I keep those photos in a folder I almost never open. Not as punishment for myself, but as documentation, as evidence that the world keeps moving whether you're in it or not, and that absence isn't the same as peace, and that the people who take years from you don't stop existing just because you're gone. Gerald exists somewhere in this city, 11 months into his 18-month sentence, probably planning the version of himself he'll present when he gets out. I don't know if he'll try to reach me. I don't know what I'll do if he does. What I do know is this: I am here. I am 33 years old and I am here, in my apartment, with Sasha asleep in the next room, and Imani's drawings on my refrigerator, and a job that means something, and 11 years of someone else's crime behind me like a long shadow that gets shorter as the sun moves. It's still there. I won't pretend it isn't. But I'm moving, and so is the light.